Hello, I'm Christina Davis, Director of the Program on U.S.-Japan Relations. I'm very glad to welcome you here today to a seminar on High-Tech Alliance, Pursuing Economic Security Through Closer U.S.-Japan Science and Technology Cooperation. We are really fortunate to be looking at the new dimensions in U.S.-Japan cooperation that are expanding into technology, as seen with the Osaka G20 meeting, where Prime Minister Abe launched the Data Free Flow with Trust initiative and continued with the US-Japan bilateral trade agreement, including a gold standard provision for digital trade rules that many hope will be followed in other trade agreements. But of course, as an alliance, technical collaboration includes defense security and many dimensions of cybersecurity and technology sharing. Security of the supply chains has been a prominent topic, and thinking about how countries can make sure their supply chains are stable and secure, and most importantly, can get us our holiday gifts in time. So we are really fortunate today to have a leading expert to help guide us through this conversation. I am happy to introduce Jim Schoff, who is the Senior Director of the US-Japan Next Alliance Initiative at the Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA in Washington, D.C. In the Obama administration, he served as Senior Advisor for East Asia Policy at the US Office of the Secretary of Defense from 2010 to 2012. Previously, he was the Director of the Japan Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And in 2018, he received the Nakasone Award of Excellence from the Nakasone Peace Institute. Jim Schoff is the author and co-author of many policy reports and writing on a range of topics, including such as tools for trilateralism, improving US-Japan-Korea cooperation to manage complex contingencies, the Uncommon Alliance for the Common Good, US-Japan after the Cold War, and most recently, High-Tech Alliance, Challenges and Opportunities for US-Japan Science and Technology Collaboration. We are very happy to hear his research in this latest report and look at the economic security questions. This seminar is being sponsored with the special series of Japan-US Cooperation in Digital Governance. I'd like to briefly announce our next seminar, which is on Japan-US economic security policy linkages in the Taiwan Straits, where we will be joined with a panel both across East Asia and the United States, Tanya Chi, Sadamasu Ue, Shelley Rigger, Danny Russell, and that'll be a great conversation to continue our attention to economic security issues in East Asia. I'd like to remind you about Zoom etiquette, that we would like you to keep your microphone muted. We are having a hybrid session today, so we have many of our associates here joining us in the room with myself and Jim, but we also have people joining us for the webinar online. And so we will be taking questions both from those in the room as well as those who decide to write in on the chat in Zoom. Thank you very much. I would like to now switch over to Jim, let you get started.
Thank you. Okay, terrific. Well, thank you, Christina. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you, Shin, for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to come back to Cambridge, where I lived and worked for about 7 years before going to Washington in the Defense Department, and it's great to be back and to be back in person with some of you, and welcome online. I'll talk for about 30 minutes or so about the research that I've been conducting both at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace when I was there, but also the initiative that we're launching at the Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA, the Next Alliance Initiative, which is heavily focused on bilateral dialogue on new and emerging policy challenges for the US-Japan alliance. And economic security is certainly a very trendy topic these days, but it means something different than I think the previous iteration in the 1990s. In that era, the focus was mostly on fostering competitiveness. For example, President Clinton or candidate Clinton at that time, proposed an Economic Security Council for the White House, which eventually became the National Economic Council. But this was all amid Clinton's push behind globalization, ratifying NAFTA, and normalizing trade relations with China and trying to get China into the WTO. So economic security was not synonymous with competition or strategic competition with China the way it's become today. Today, it also has a much more direct connection to national or military security than it did in the past. And as with most things concerning security, there are defensive aspects and offensive aspects. Japan generally refers to these as steps to enhance protection on the one hand for technology, supply chains, etc. This includes export controls, investment screening measures, and so-called research integrity. And then there's promotion on the other hand. In other words, steps to make Japanese industry more innovative, more competitive in the critical technologies for the future by subsidies and international collaboration. So today I'd like to look at economic security issue from a US-Japan alliance perspective to see where we are in sync and where we are coordinating poorly. I will talk about some gaps in the way that the allies address information and technology security issues and how they incentivize or discourage international collaboration. And I'll propose some ways to potentially fill these gaps. So as you know, the US-Japan science exchanges and collaboration have a long history, starting in the 1960s with work on natural resources, medical sciences, and expanding to nearly every field you can imagine. The political and foreign policy backdrop or context for this collaboration has evolved over time. It's ebbed and flowed in terms of perceived priority or opportunity. But I think it's fair to say today that we have never seen the kind of bilateral alignment that exists today in terms of policymaker interests, number one. Number two, a widely perceived need for foreign collaboration. Number three, specific areas of research focus. And then four, the overall goals of collaboration. And I picked three main goals for the US-Japan today: mitigating climate change or its impact, being able to control pandemics, and staying ahead of China in a wide range of critical technologies and scientific discovery. Oop, I just knocked the microphone there. Now, this last objective of competition with China is arguably, I think, the most pertinent in a bilateral context because there are more opportunities for multilateral engagement on the first two. And it's in this third area of competition with China that has potentially a bigger impact on the way we conduct science cooperation within the alliance. So I would say the case for US science and technology collaboration is the case for US-Japan science and technology collaboration is quite clear. Japan is the third largest investor in research and development behind the United States and China. And Japanese companies fund more research and development in the United States than any other country's firms. Japan is also the third most prolific patent filer in the world behind China and the United States. Pooling resources, data, and talent would benefit both allies. The question is not whether bilateral science and technology cooperation is a shared strategic opportunity, but how to adapt to it to keep up with new geopolitical realities and the rate of technological change. So I have a few slides here to show you, to talk about some different concepts and the situation in Japan and the United States on this front. So we'll start by looking at alliance management. So we have a 2+2 process to coordinate the most important bilateral issues. But for science and technology cooperation, it's ministry to ministry, lab to lab, it's ad hoc and bottom up. So we have the 2+2 process. I wonder if I can use this or not. Oh, there we go. Handles all the foreign and security policy overlaps, but when you get into economy, environment, science, technology, it's ministry to ministry, in office to office. I think what we need to do is have a more strategic and coordinated collaboration on the science and technology front to protect our economic security and promote innovation and competitiveness. And we have to have a compatible environment to do that. Now, the main vehicle for our collaboration is the 1988 Agreement on Science and Technology Cooperation, drafted at the height of our bilateral economic competition. And it significantly limits flexibility regarding private sector and dual-use technologies. So I'll come back to that later on. Many of you are probably familiar, but I want to provide a quick orientation of Japan's science and technology infrastructure. Oh, I don't have that slide. Okay, I'll go without that slide. For some reason, I don't have that slide. It's essentially a flow chart or org chart of Japan's different agencies and involved in science and technology. There is the Council on Science, Technology, and Innovation, or CISTI, highlighted, which is highlighted in green on my wonderful chart that I don't have here, is ultimately responsible, that sits within the Cabinet Office, responsible for the Science and Technology Basic Plan, and it is supported by a secretariat staffed by about 100 people pulled from various ministries and agencies. Japan's Ministry of Education, Culture, Sports, Science, and Technology, or MEXT, is the biggest government player in science investment, and essentially the custodian or administrator for many of Japan's most capable science and research organizations. Japan Science and Technology Agency, RIKEN, JAXA, the Space Agency, Japan Atomic Energy Agency, and the big universities, et cetera. METI, the Economy, Trade, and Industry Ministry, and Ministry of Internal Affairs and Communications are becoming more engaged and influential on this front. And to some extent, a competition for resources and policy direction is migrating up to the CISTI cabinet dynamic and playing out at the NSC as well. So after a few years ago, after MEXT stumbled in a scandal, for example, METI made leadership gains within CISTI and has been pushing the government to be more aggressive in the science and technology competition with China. And this has resulted in battles over funding, program design, and where to draw the line on certain potential dual-use technologies related to artificial intelligence and quantum computing or quantum information science. From this past spring, the Council for Science and Technology and Innovation became a policy secretariat, which is an upgrade and gives it some more budgetary authority. So, and I'll find my org chart later and be able to show it so everybody can see it later on. But here's a quick look at how government research funding is distributed by ministry in Japan. You can see how MEXT oversees the most spending, followed by METI. The recent growth in other is mostly due to increased allocations to the Environment Ministry. For comparison, on the US side, you can see that there is no simple macro counterpart for MEXT on this front. But there are strong existing bilateral relationships among various subcomponents. So NASA, JAXA, the space agencies work together quite often. National Science Foundation and Japan's Science and Technology Agency, Department of Energy and the Japan Atomic Energy Agency, et cetera. And the US national labs and some big universities in Japan have MOUs of collaboration as well. This is something we can build upon effectively within the alliance. Of course, it's important to note that the private sector is the largest funder of research and development in both countries. Here I show the United States primarily, but it's even more so the case in Japan, and you can see how business funding for research and development far outstrips that of the public sector. And on the right-hand side, you can also see that it's not just defense-oriented firms, Boeing, United Technologies, Lockheed Martin. It's really the big tech firms, Amazon, Alphabet, Intel, Microsoft, Apple, are driving a lot of the investment in science and technology. My last comparison slide is here to give a feel for how research is funded and conducted in Japan compared to the United States. The two flow charts are not the same scale. You can see the percentages there to give some comparison, but I show it to highlight a couple of things. One is the smaller role that Japanese government funding plays in the national picture. I wonder if I can move this over a little bit. So you see the Japanese government plays a slightly smaller role compared to the US on funding. And another is how the Japanese government research funding goes, how little Japanese government funding goes directly to the business sector. Also, international contributions or rest of world are very small in Japan. Now, there is a concerted effort underway in Japan to expand the international component of scientific endeavors, and this presents another opportunity, I think, for the Alliance to build upon. Japan's so-called Moonshot Research and Development Program is a good example. Although it's still organized domestically, this multi-goal oriented initiative is actively recruiting international collaborators. Some of these goals involve artificial intelligence, robotics, quantum computing, and sustainable resource circulation, among others. And the Japanese government's new push to realize a carbon neutral society by 2050 will add funding and perhaps a greater sense of urgency to research in this area. Also, the government's push for digital transformation and creation of a new digital agency should be another opportunity for closer US-Japan cooperation, especially involving the private sectors. These are all themes that we saw in the 6th basic plan that Japan put out on science and technology, revolving around the central vision of Society 5.0, or its vision of a human-centered society where high integration of cyberspace and physical space can promote economic development and help solve social problems. Now, as a growing number of Japanese officials believe that there are scientific and technological components of Society 5.0, primarily in the AI, quantum computing, and data flows that could be exploited by by China to Japan's disadvantage, unless it takes steps to protect certain advancements. And they see a consensus forming with the United States and the European Union on this front, even if the details are far from clear. And they're taking steps to develop a national economic and technology security strategy and new legislation to be introduced next year to address this. It could even include legal changes to make that would allow non-military classified research to be carried out with international partners, although for some this is still a bridge too far in Japan. So as part of the research, let me see, I think, I'll come back to this later. I was going to take this down here for a second. Well, sorry, I'll leave that up. I suppose people can see me okay up here, but I'm going to talk for a little while before I get back to the slides. So as research for this project, we interviewed a lot of Japanese companies conducting and funding research and development in the United States to understand what their experience was like. And there's a variety of challenges. As I said, Japan is the largest non-US funder of research and development in the United States. But there are sometimes challenges integrating the data and the way data is controlled. So we had a Japanese company that was going to participate in a large Department of Energy funded project out in California with various universities and a big utility in California to provide data for research on use of AI and improving efficiency of electricity grids. But ultimately, the private data that the utility had could not be accessed by the Japanese company because of the controlled and classified information rules, or the rules governing the way private customer data was handled, and would have required a major investment by the Japanese company to adapt its IT systems to accommodate the US rules. So that lack of compatibility led to the Japanese partner pulling out of that project. There were other examples of problems with so-called deemed exports, where Japan could not get expedited trade treatment in certain defense technology exports because their hiring of non-Japanese and the way export controls apply to non-Japanese in Japanese companies in Japan, they're treated essentially, once they live in Japan as for 6 months, they're treated as domestic or internal hirings. So the U.S. State Department would not expedite various contracts with Japan on this front, which they would do with other Five Eyes countries, for example. So we've seen similar issues related to the export of data from projects that Japanese companies are funding here in the United States. Eventually, the results of that project are all going to be published, so it's not classified in any sense, but the raw data cannot be transferred out of the United States to even the Japanese headquarters back in Tokyo that is helping to fund the project. And so the teams cannot collaborate on the same data in real time in that regard. So you're not getting the benefit of this larger ecosystem that we want to and need to, and especially in the data sharing piece, when you get into use of artificial intelligence to help expedite and speed up the process of analyzing data for scientific discovery, how we build and share those data sets and test beds is, we still have a long way to go on that front. So what the US has been doing on this front is trying to improve standards on the one hand, and you see it in the Defense Department has issued a new cybersecurity maturity model certification process, or CMMC, so that all defense contractors have to meet certain standards in order to contract with the US government. Of course, that trickles down to any Japanese companies that want to get into the Defense Department supply chain on that front and keep up with that. We see the US launching a new science defense-related research program with the UK called Bilateral Academic Research Initiatives that links, that's defense money funding academic research in certain technologies with potential dual use, but in a classified setting. And that's something that is being done between the US and the UK, but not something that could be done currently with Japan because of the way Japan's security clearances are issued. US has entered into an industrial security annex agreement with India, for example, as part of the GSOMIA, the General Agreement on Sharing of Military Information. They now have an industrial annex to facilitate defense-related trade on that front. Could maybe the US and Japan potentially develop an industrial security annex? There's certain hurdles that Japan would have to clear on that front. In particular, one key issue is for the US to enter into an ISA with another country, there has to be a designated sole authority for information security. And right now, there are multiple authorities for information security. So Japan would have to actually create maybe a Tokubetsu-Kikan or some kind of special agency or commission within the cabinet that would pull together the various stakeholders, but would be designated as the national sole authority for information security. On the US side, it's the National Disclosure Policy Committee, the NDPC, is that sole authority, and they are the ones who determine whether a technology can be sold to somebody or licensed to somebody in certain areas of classified technology. Let's see. Oh, the other example to mention, another interesting one, at the National Science Foundation. You know, we've heard a little bit about the FBI's China initiative during the Trump years, where they were going after university researchers who were not fully disclosing some connections that they had to Chinese organizations. And this idea of research integrity was evolving beyond just whether you're doing proper, rigorous research that can be replicated and is ethical and et cetera. Research integrity became more a wider view to include, or do they have some kind of nefarious connection to Chinese organizations? And are we indirectly funding scientific advancement in China through NSF funding? So they undertook a whole series of audits of past applications and grant proposals and projects. And they eventually discovered that about between 8 and 11% or so of the applications all had some kind of anomaly in them, which of varying degrees of severity, but usually involved something where later an article was published based on that research and credited a Chinese entity that was never mentioned in the original proposal for the NSF funding, et cetera. So some of those were referred over to the FBI for further follow-up investigation. But this has caused some concern or worry in Japan about, to some extent, Japan is increasing the requirements on accountability and transparency in terms of government-funded research, but not necessarily going to the same level as getting an FBI-like knocking on doors and arresting researchers in that regard. So trying to develop a harmonized or compatible system in all these different areas of security clearances, information security, and research integrity, et cetera, without simply having Japan have to kind of follow the US model or follow whatever the US adopts. And there's some cases where the FBI has backed off of some of the cases that they brought during the Trump years because they didn't quite have as much evidence as they thought. So Japan is getting ready to launch or submit an economic security legislative package. It probably will include some ability to expand the issuing of security clearances to private companies and researchers, engineers, and researchers in universities who are working on commercial technology, not necessarily a defense-specific technology. That will help to some degree between fostering US-Japan collaboration on this front. The deemed export coverage, Japan is looking to fix that kind of loophole within its law on that front, so we can expect some measures there. There will be probably tighter controls on export-controlled research, and ideally we would have kind of a harmonized approach or a fast-track ability to, in certain cases or certain projects, be able to share data back and forth between the two of us, that it wouldn't necessarily be considered an export if it's within our alliance bubble of science and technology cooperation. This idea of a sole designated security authority is probably not going to be part of the economic security package in Japan, but that would be useful in my opinion. Also, what we need to see, or I think what we need to see, is the development of a cadre of security, information and technology security professionals in Japan in the government sphere. We haven't seen that to date. In the US, you have something called GS 0080 class. You can have, that's a classification of a federal employee where you can spend your entire career just in the information security, technology security realm, and you can move up from entry level all the way up to a 3-star general level or equivalent. And it's not just in defense, it's across all of the US government. Let me work toward the end of my formal remarks. Now I think, let's see. So my last slide here, I think to capitalize on this opportunity, I think we probably will need to utilize existing mechanisms rather than create something brand new for the Alliance to use. And the Joint High-Level Committee was created by this 1988 Science and Technology Agreement that I mentioned before. It involves ministers from both countries that are involved related to science and technology investment and innovation. And there's a joint working level committee under that also meets and supports the high level committee. You have the Office of Science, Technology and Technology Policy in the White House with a emerging counterpart of SISTI. That could be, this is a proposal to try to, this slide is a proposal that we put forward to try to increase more flexibility of private sector involvement and dual use technology collaboration in science and technology. Currently, our science and technology agreement is only for peaceful use, right? So we're not doing science for defense purposes under this agreement. But when it was designed in 1988, the US industry actually lobbied the US government to create a council, a private sector council that would work with this committee, mostly to limit the sharing of science and technology with Japan. We were worried that Japanese companies in the aerospace field and other areas would get too much access to US science and technology data. So in that era, when the committee was created, it was actually trying to kind of limit sharing. We don't have that problem anymore. And so we proposed this idea of a Japan-US Strategic Science and Technology Innovation Council, drawn from private sector, national laboratories. So getting real scientists and engineers into the formal government-to-government process of science and technology cooperation. Now it's mostly a bureaucratic exercise where they kind of tell each other what they're doing. You know, this is what we're doing on the cancer moonshot, or this is what we're doing on climate change technology investment and this and that. And they just share information about what they're doing, but we're not actually doing real science together, and we're not necessarily doing it in the most strategic areas. And so having people who can help navigate the commercial science and commercial technology sector for how they apply to strategic, not necessarily defense, but strategically important to each country. That was a proposal that we put forward. You know, sharing funding, test beds, access to expensive research assets can be useful. But I think finding this right balance of flexibility with regard to hiring researcher talent as well. So maybe there's ways to harmonize a science visa where researchers and certain talent can move more easily from country to country. We could involve countries in the European Union on that front as well, perhaps India and others, so that we have as large of an ecosystem as possible, working on some of the most strategically important technologies of the future. And with that, I think I'll stop my formal remarks. We can, right, because that's about the timing, I think.
Great.
Thank you. I'll make sure I get back to you that other slide on the org chart. So I feel surprised by that.
Thank you. That was a very rich presentation. Amy, should I stay here or go up to the podium when I'm taking questions?
If you like, I can move the camera so that we can see both of you during the Q&A.
Okay, perfect. That was really fascinating, and I felt the tensions of the idea that the US-Japan technology cooperation and shared R&D compared to, I think we're the same generation. When we started studying Japan in the 1980s, and there was, as you mentioned, all this rivalry about supercomputer development by Japan was a threat to the United States.
HD TVs were gonna take over.
Exactly, and the semiconductor dispute. And so it's really a whiplash now to see this, like US-Japan should jointly develop semiconductors and a science technology for shared funding of research and the next AI technology. And you said that the concerns of the 1980s when the US wanted to limit sharing is no longer a problem, which is so interesting to think. Why is it no longer a problem?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, of course, companies are still protective of their own intellectual property, and they don't necessarily want to share everything with other companies, even in their own country, let alone with Japan. So there still is a competitive aspect for sure, whether it's in the automotive industry or semiconductors and the like. But I think at a government-to-government level and a political level, so in Congress and in chambers of commerce and the like, the perception is we truly are on the same team, and we could talk a lot about the steps that Japan took, or the way that Japan responded to this idea of techno-nationalism when it was kind of arising in the 80s and 90s. I mean, Semtech, the Semiconductor Consortium, was a DARPA-funded, US-only operation in the beginning. But within 10 years or so after it started, Japanese companies and Taiwanese companies became partners in that, because they realized, we were on the same team, and there were aspects of, yes, there's intellectual property they want to protect, but there were other parts of the industry that they all benefited from sharing certain investments and for access to resources and the like. And I think, up and down the line, whether it's in the military side, whether it's in chambers of commerce or Congress, there is a perception that Japan is a key player. So you're not talking about a bit player, as I mentioned there. It's US, China, Japan, China, US, Japan. I mean, Japan is right there up with us, and to combine or collaborate and pool resources and talent just makes a tremendous amount of sense, and it's manageable because we play by the same rules. Japan did adopt, react to the various trade pressures and things that the US called for during the trade wars, and became, for the most part, an economy that we would say is operating under similar rules. Now, we still have some complaints here and there. Right. We have complaints with Canada and lumber and dairy and this and that. So those problems exist, but not as fundamentally. I don't think we view Japan as a fundamentally different economic structure, or that their economy is operating differently such that we can't manage that.
So some part is that Japan has shifted to become more rule-abiding, like-minded in economic policies. The other side that's interesting is the 1980s was a rivalry with the Soviet Union on the military front, but not on the economic front. And in some ways, now that rivalry with China is both military and economic, it may push stronger for the alliance to also unify on both economic and military dimension.
I think so.
And so now we're seeing this consolidation of technology alliance that you propose,
right,
which would be so interesting if it could happen.
Yeah, but again, there is this sense. So you talk about reputation. I think Japan's reputation in the United States has certainly improved in the context of competitiveness and the way we compete. The reputation on information security, though, and technology security is not as strong. To some extent, that's well-deserved, and to some extent, that's not well-deserved. Like, I think Japan is not getting credit for some of the steps that it has taken in recent years to improve its ability to its cybersecurity capacity and rules governing information security protection. The state secrets law, designated secrets law, a few years back, really improved the playing field, or the ability of the US and Japan to share information beyond just defense-related information. So there's a public relations angle to this too, because and we talked about this a little bit in the workshop before. But some of this is very quantifiable. You have this rule, we have this rule, it's exactly the same. You have this protocol, we have this protocol. But a lot of this kind of work is also gut feeling. Do I trust my partner, my counterpart? When you have a Department of Energy national lab, Lawrence Livermore National Lab enters into a memorandum of understanding on cooperation with Osaka University, which they do in high energy density, HED science, high energy density science, which is primarily the use of the laser assets that they have Osaka has some great lasers. And of course, Lawrence Livermore has some of the best. And the time that researchers can get access to these lasers to do their experiments in astrophysics and different things is very limited. So if you can have two of these late assets and a bigger pool of people using them and sharing ideas, that's much better. And so in areas that are less, in areas that are less sensitive, more mass public benefit, public good, it's easy to do that. When we start getting into these more classified kind of areas or energy economic security, then you have more questions about, well, is Osaka University protecting their information the same way that the national lab is? No, so that's taking steps to improve economic security are important, but then I hope Japan also then gets credit for what it does and kind of promotes itself as being, on par in these areas.
I just hope that the US would not push Japan away from openness to foreign exchange. When you said that the Japanese companies' treatment of foreign workers as if they were nationals was one of the reasons they were not trusted for defense contracting, I was thinking this is a first where we're saying that Japan is too open to foreigners being equal, and the US is going to push Japan to treat foreigners with more discrimination.
Well,
I understand you're saying it's for the critical technology information exchange.
Right.
There's a national security concern. At the same time, the public interest in top research, top private company efficiency is to let the best workers participate. Absolutely.
And I certainly don't want to suggest that somehow Japan should limit the hiring of foreign talent. It has to do with the legal authority by how what authority METI has to limit the transfer of data and products to those people within the company. So it doesn't mean all the foreigners need to be on the outside, but giving METI the ability to put some individuals on the outside, or basically a higher bar for them to prove that they belong on the inside. So they just don't have a process to do that at this point. And so that's the US question.
Okay.
So
I monopolized conversation too much. We have some
Sorry.
questions from the audience, and so I should turn over. I'm going to collect 3 questions. Our associate, Mr. Tokuhiro Ikeda, who's senior fellow at the Harvard University Asia Center and a former vice admiral of the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Forces, who is here as an associate doing research with the Asia Center on maritime security in East Asia. He will ask the first question. And I'll ask you to keep answers short so that we can get to the next.
Yeah,
I can see the list building up.
Thank you very much. Very meaningful presentation. I'd like to ask about the confidentiality issue. You have already mentioned some issue and some efforts both of countries. So, but in recent era, we have no border between the defense technology and commercial technology. So I think that Japan's allergy to the military are a major obstacle to Japan US joint technology research and development. So Japan passed the specially designated secret act in 2013, but at that time it became extremely vulnerable due to intense debate in the Diet that bisected public opinion. The second administration had been supported by many people and had been operating stably. But even that stable administration had made a great effort to enact the current secret law. The general view is that it is difficult to strengthen this act any further. So this situation, how do you think about the effect to the cooperative development and research?
Yeah, no, there's no doubt there is this allergy, as you describe it, because in many cases in Japan, as I understand it, various background checks are carried out with some regularity in daycare centers, at casinos. So the non-defense background checks happen and are accepted in Japan. But when you start doing it maybe for Hitachi and NTT in AI or quantum or with these potential defense applications, I mean, all technology has defense applications of some way. There's a political reaction to it. I think it just needs some leadership behind it. I think, and there has been some progress on that front where people say, you know, okay, I trust my government's not going to, you know, become a military dominated, you know, and get involved in wars and support. The Japanese people don't want to get involved in the killing of other people. I respect that. But I think leadership on that having some additional flexibility to be able to carry out classified work with other countries' companies in these different technologies are ultimately about protecting Japan's national interests and the people themselves. And so making that connection is the job of the political leadership.
Our next question is by Mr. Hirokazu Watanabe, who is an associate with the program on U.S.-Japan relations this year, doing research on retaliatory trade measures for national security exception in the WTO. When in Japan, he works at the Ministry of Finance for the Cabinet Secretariat.
Thank you very much for your very useful presentation. Actually, what I wanted to ask you is almost a similar question as Kenneth did, so I changed the questions. As for your diagram of your slide, the last slide, about the contrast of the Japanese and US NSCs, and as far as I know, there is a very huge disparity between the policy making and enforcement capabilities between the US NSCs and Japanese NSC. So it's such a asymmetrical difference in capabilities. I wonder if Japan's NSC can play the same role as the NSC in the US. So could you tell me your thoughts about this one?
Yeah, no, I think you're correct that there is a disparity, an unevenness between the two, but you know, there's no other way I can think of to facilitate interagency coordination between the two governments than to have the NSC to NSC connection be there. And it was actually Japan that created the economic desk or office within the NSC in a way that actually, even though they don't have as many people or as much expertise behind it, that position of the economic office in the NSC is kind of the most applicable to these economic security challenges that we face. On the US side, we have the Economic Council and the National Security Council, and there's some overlap between them, and there's lots of people involved, but it's hard for that Japanese policymaker to find a direct counterpart in the US government. He has to, whenever he goes to Washington, he has to meet with 4 or 5 different people. So it's complicated to get this correct. I do think that the embassies can play an important role in facilitating this because they have the most tight-knit interagency bodies dedicated to the purpose of better bilateral relations. So they can reach back into their ministries and departments to get information. And there may be ways to leverage the embassies a little bit more effectively in collaboration with the NSC. So US Embassy in Tokyo working more directly with the Japanese NSC, and the Japanese Embassy in Washington working more directly with the US. There's some potential there. But these challenges are so huge. We just have to do the best we can. The US NSC is not sufficient either, really, to deal with the supply chain dynamics and all these different issue areas. I would say, though, that I do think the private sector role is particularly important for many different reasons, in part because they're the ones driving most of the research anyway. So we can't just rely on government to government connections and having the Chamber of Commerce and Keidanren and all the different connections, as I did put up in that alliance management map in the beginning. It's okay to have this lab to lab, office to office collaboration, and we should support that and keep that. I just think we need some kind of strategic, collaborative, knowledgeable body working within the joint high level committee, or at least advising it, to help make that connection to pick out the priorities, and then let the mechanisms that already exist support that.
This actually leads very nicely into the question from Harvard Business School professor Meg Rithmeyer, who writes in asking, how does the Japanese business community feel about the security issues involved in collaborating with the United States and China? And of course, there may be sectoral differences, but she's interested in how Japanese business community views. And next question I'll ask pulled together. University of Washington professor Sadia Pekkanen writes in asking, beyond the context of staying ahead of Japan, what other motivations exist for security and technology collaboration? You know, if you were to set aside the China factor, would you expect less collaboration or more collaboration? And she's especially interested in thinking about a second dimension, which is the alliance cooperation about space utilization, both military and economic.
Yeah.
So that's actually 3 questions.
Well, just quickly on the Japanese business views. I mean, I think there's a wide range of views, but to summarize some threads that I've heard, Japan does not want to get locked in or caught in completely having to choose sides, in terms of that they don't necessarily want to be thrown into all kinds of entity lists and export control restrictions, and they want some flexibility to continue to be able to access the Chinese market, but they increasingly recognize the importance of investment in this area, information security, technology security, as an investment as opposed to just a cost. They're certainly earlier on, it was always, oh, the Americans want us to, now we have to spend more on this protection, or they won't share this information with us unless we build this separate data facility, and this. It was viewed as kind of a burden. I think there's a growing recognition in the value of that investment and that ability to protect the company's IP, and then also to support a national strategy of competitiveness. But it's the labor force is not quite there. There's never enough funding and money, and they want as much flexibility as possible and not get locked into kind of it's the U.S. against China, and they have to pick one side completely. So it's balancing all of those different aspects. But it's a really interesting question. You could do a whole separate paper on how that is coming together. And there's the interesting dynamic of Japan right now is actively trying to foster the growth of its defense industry, or sustain its defense industry. And we see it with the FX, the F-2 fighter replacement project, and the like. And we could talk a lot about a very new technological challenge in terms of this idea of heavily subsidizing domestic industry to build a 30-year, 40-year fighter plane. I'm not sure if that's the we're not totally seeing eye to eye on that front right now, and that's a challenge. On the second question, I think the collaboration, if I understood the question correctly, if we didn't have this economic security focus as much, I mean, I think it would resemble more the way our science cooperation evolved beforehand, which was very open. The work we did together in space between JAXA and NASA was quite extensive, and the challenge now is the fact that the Ministry of Defense is hiring JAXA people and giving them clearances and pulling the space into the defense realm in a way, and private companies are playing a role in the space realm in a way that is forcing people to make decisions about walling off certain things and making collaboration and cooperation more difficult, perhaps. I know this professor, and she really knows this issue well. I should get her to talk about it. But the effort at greater compatibility. So one of the issues in space now, as I understand it, is we're trying to get more interoperability among all these different space systems, right? So somebody could plug into a satellite and fix something or make it be able to do something different. But the more you drive interoperability and kind of uniformity in all this, are you making it harder to protect it? Are you making it harder to, be secure? And I think there's real tension there. Ideally, space should not be militarized, at least as a domain. But that ship is already kind of leaving the port, and I don't know if we can rein that back in, but I think it would be better if we are able to work with Japan and other countries to pull ourselves back from over militarizing and that element, and leave that to be a more open space for scientific collaboration.
I think you're right. We don't want to have the militarization of space, but it does sound like the rivalries are pushing that forward as well, as China is developing an active space program.
Yeah.
So we have another question on the security dimension from Professor at University of Tokyo, Kaoru Iokide, who's also an associate in our program, and he writes in, do you expect any change of the practice of status of forces agreements, such as the coordination between SOFA-related committees and JUSTTIC?
JUSTTIC is the Justic. Oh, that's the that's our proposal, right? The Japan and US. I don't see a SOFA connection on that front. So the status of forces agreement is, the US government hates to talk about that and does not want to change anything because they have all these different agreements around the world. And once they start changing one, then everybody's going to want to change different things. So they always talk about improving the execution of the status of performance agreement, or improving the way we behave and conduct and operate under the current agreement. So I think I see that as separate from the science cooperation, science and technology cooperation. And I think most of the opportunities in science and technology cooperation are in the private sector, in universities, in agencies that are not necessarily defense focused. So it's about improving and harmonizing the way we operate in that world. We've gotten good at harmonizing the way we share information, manage interoperability and this and that within the defense sphere, because that's such a limited area. But the other area is so open-ended, and there's so many stakeholders that it's really challenging to pull that together.
So let me ask you our last question, which is right on this point of how do you collaborate at the research university side, where we're not used to worrying about security. And an anonymous from Canada post, LIS, asks, thank you for the wonderful insights. At an institution level, especially for universities and research centers from the other Five Eye allies, especially Canada, where they do not have access to a centralized support system from the government when they have doubts or questions about certain research collaboration. What is your advice for the administrators for these universities and research centers? At the end of the day, the goal is to protect genuine collaboration while discouraging bad actors from taking advantage of good intention of academia. just to be clear, I am concerned about where people may try to collaborate with a faculty member, say in Canada or the United States, in order to access critical technology. What would be your advice about these broader actors that are not used to having to worry about such issues?
Yeah, and that's a real concern in Japan, I think, because, you know, on the US side, they have more experience working with defense money. You know, you remember that the Department of Defense's role in public funding and DOE's role as well means that a lot of universities in the US have gotten comfortable with and created a system whereby they can manage their classified research over here and the rest over here. Japan doesn't want, most researchers in Japan don't want to have to invest money in that kind of whole separate infrastructure. They're not as comfortable, I think, with that dynamic. So to me, this is not directly answering that question, but it gets back to that public relations aspect, that PR side of things. I would encourage Japan to empower a couple of its kind of government affiliated institutions. So AIST, the Advanced Industrial Science Technology Agency, NEDO, the New Energy Development Organization, AIST, NEDO, RIKEN. You know, you could create kind of cells or almost like a special operations team, you know, that meets higher levels of standards in terms of physical security and background checks and this and that, so that they are viewed as, oh, you're dealing with AIST on this project, or you're dealing with NEDO on this project. Oh, they're top notch. They're just like us. And so there would be more free flow of collaboration on that front. So not everybody has to all meet this high standard. You could create centers of excellence that are recognized as more compatible, and then let the researchers from the different universities become employees or temporary employees, or become they can operate there through those centers of excellence, rather than making Osaka University and Tsukuba and others all have to meet those standards. So, but to get more directly at that question, you know, in the US, they're pushing back too, because, you know, for a while the FBI was going around knocking on doors telling them don't collaborate with China. They're stealing all your information and this and that. And it was kind of overboard. And there's got to be, everybody wants to protect open science and basic science and for the public good. And I think that's important to do. And it doesn't matter if somebody else, you know, reads about it, and it's all going to be published and it's all going to be shared. But there are legitimate, as you get higher up the food chain or the sophistication level of development of the technology, it's natural for it to be protected. So I think it's about transparency, accountability. You know, that idea of the National Science Foundation audits I mentioned. You know, NSF is not going to change its role in. They don't do any classified research. They fund only open research. They're not going to change the way they do business, but they want more transparency, more accountability, and making sure they at least know before they give the money who it is they're working with and how the project is going to be conducted. So I guess it's about universities making sure they meet their own standards, being open about this is the way we're going to do it, and then making sure they can police their own standards so that the expectation levels are similar. I don't know. No.
Great. Thank you. That is incredibly good advice, because we don't want the militarization of the university either.
No.
So if we can create checkpoints and accountability standards but remain open, that would be the best of both worlds.
Every discussion I have in Washington on this realm, whenever we start getting into this idea of classified research and walling things off, everybody says, you know, we would not be where we are today if we had done that years ago. That the openness is what has, you know, really delivered the results in science. And look at the, you know, the pandemic and the development of vaccines and the like. There's always tension between intellectual property and profit and public good, and we can manage that. but not throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Right, to
As the
continue
old
to
saying
promote,
goes.
promote cooperation. Well, thank you so much for helping to guide us through the issues, both for US-Japan Alliance cooperation and for research centers and a whole range of topics. It's really been fascinating.
Well, thank you so much for the
So much.
opportunity to be here with you all.
I appreciate your coming, and I also would like to thank you all for joining us and thank Amy, Emma, and Shin for putting together a successful hybrid workshop and meeting today. Thank you so much.